Hello, my name is Emmy DeGrappa. Each week, we bring you stories asking our guests the question why. We learn about passion, purpose, and the human experience. Brought to you by Wyoming Humanities with the generous support of the Wyoming Community Foundation. This is What's Your Why? Today, we are talking to media artist and filmmaker Alyson Spery. Welcome, Alyson.
Thanks for having me, Emmy.
Well, thank you for being here. I was so thrilled to attend your program at the Center for the Arts in Jackson Hole and want to learn so much more about how this project came to be. And tell me the official name of it.
The Sister Cities Docuseries is the screening you went to.
Okay, it is really primarily about the sister cities being Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and Tlaxcala, Mexico, correct?
Yes.
Before we learn about that, I want to learn about your journey into filmmaking. Where did you grow up, first of all?
I grew up on the eastern shore of Maryland in a college town called Salisbury and moved away for college and then moved out west to Jackson right after graduation many years ago.
Why Jackson?
A friend of mine from college who seemed so much more worldly than I was at that time, she said Jackson was her favorite place on earth. And I had a job in the summer after college, working for an outward bound school. And I didn't know what I was doing for the winter and fancied myself a skier because my family had spent some holidays over the years, Christmases skiing. I thought about moving to Jackson because my friend said it was her favorite place. We decided to come together and spent a winter that's turned into 6 non-consecutive years living in this area.
Isn't that like a very common story, don't you think? People come and they stay.
Yeah.
Because they fall in love with the area, the Tetons, the beauty and grandeur of this beautiful place we live in. It's just hard to describe it, actually.
Yeah, definitely. I was pretty in awe when I first arrived here in 2006, and then felt a few years later this itch to do something more than I found my opportunities here in Jackson. I had worked in the service industry. I had worked as a youth care worker for the Van Vleck House and taught skiing. And I just felt like I was outgrowing the opportunities that seemed available to me as a young 20-something and moved up to Montana and actually spent 6 years in Bozeman and eventually made my way back to Jackson in 2018.
So how did filmmaking become your passion? Was that your degree? Or did it something that you decided you were going to take up and learn about and it became part of who you are?
You know, I think filmmaking has been like this curiosity for me for years, but something that felt really unachievable, unattainable, and just like not something I could do. I had studied public policy in undergrad and was dead set on becoming an attorney and working in social justice through the avenues of law. When I got into law school, I ended up deferring because I was working a job in Bozeman that really was like a marriage of all of these experiences I'd had in my 20s that was giving me, like, that was really gratifying. I was managing a program for teenagers to get them engaged in the outdoors in a group mentoring program, really similar to what Emily Coombs created with the Coombs Outdoors program. But I had known a few people who had worked in the documentary film industry and was like so intrigued. And after working in social services for almost 10 years on and off, I decided that I wasn't going to continue that anymore. And I had like kind of fallen out of interest in law. I felt like it was maybe not a good fit for my personality after all. But I came from a family that like really valued education, and my mom was the first one in her family to go to college. My dad was second generation college educated. They both had masters, and my dad's an attorney. And, it was like, you're either going to be a doctor, a lawyer, or a teacher. There's like no other options, Alyson. I don't know. I'm a bit of the black sheep of the family. And I eventually just like a light bulb went off while I was in Bozeman and realized that like maybe I could try this documentary film industry thing. And there happens to be a great master's program at Montana State University in Bozeman, which I enrolled in and then promptly dropped out a semester later to take a job opportunity in Missoula working on a documentary project. I later went back and finished my MFA at the University of Montana in Missoula, and feel really lucky that the state of Montana has two very different master's programs to pursue media arts, to pursue filmmaking.
That's quite a journey. And I think it's interesting that you pursued something that was totally different than maybe your parents expected of you. And of course, there's always, I come from a family of educators as well. So I get that. And it's interesting how that does kind of become, part of your life story. And I also think it's interesting that you really were set on working even as a lawyer in social justice. And how did social justice become a passion for you?
I think it's always been there. I mean, it's like part of my personality. I'm just a fighter for the underdog, and I just can't like hold my tongue sometimes. I remember as a kid, having discussions with my parents of like, why do we need money? Why can't we just barter services and like look after one another? I don't know. It's always been there. It's who I am.
That's really cool. And I do think that, all children and young people are very altruistic and want to take care of others. I feel like kids are colorblind. They just have a different, very embracing and opening to all people. And as they get older, they become jaded. Mm-hmm. Plus social justice is its own career path. I mean, I think it's its own career path. Even if you're, volunteering for nonprofits and doing work that way, when you follow that path, it's very specific, I think. Mm-hmm. So I think it's interesting that you kind of stepped outside of the box. I'm going to do something different. So now I want you to dive back into, you moved to Jackson after you finished your media arts degree. And then what connected you to the Latino community in Jackson Hole?
I really have my partner, Pete Muldoon, to thank for this project. We have known each other for over a decade, and I was struggling with like what the next thing for me would be after wrapping up work on a community media documentary project in Missoula with recently resettled refugees, where we're teaching filmmaking skills to people so that they can tell their own stories. And we were doing it via translation in Swahili. It was an ambitious project, and I was one of many people working on it, and it was an awesome project. I'm so grateful for that opportunity. But when it finished and I was getting ready to enter my last year of film school, which meant I needed to wrap my head around what my thesis would be. This was 2017, and we were all feeling the blows of the Trump administration's policies on refugees and immigrants coming in and asylum seekers coming into the US. And Pete, who was still here in Jackson, told me what an immense blow it was having on the Jackson community. Everything that was happening on a national scale was microcosmically affecting Jackson. So I came here because I wanted to work on immigration issues. I wanted to understand what was happening with the Mexican American immigrant community. And I was really curious after I learned a little bit more about this Tlaxcalan connection. Like, what? People are all coming from like the same area? I think I had learned of Tlaxcala when I had first lived here and worked in service industry jobs. And, I would ask my coworkers where they were from, and some of them would say this place. And I just had no idea how to pronounce it, let alone where it would be on a map. And so it just didn't register at the time. But 10 years later, I was visiting Jackson, visiting Pete, and it was July 4th, and there were people dancing in Mike Yokel Park, and they were wearing these beautiful costumes, these beautiful dresses, and like really, the men had these fancy feathered headdresses on, and they had embroidery on the back of their jackets that spelled out Tlaxcala. And I was, for the first time, saw it in writing. I was like, oh, okay, where is this? I got to find out. So I moved here in 2018, and in October went to Tlaxcala for like a week-long visit for the first time.
I'm wondering how you made connection with the Tlaxcalans, the Jackson ones, the ones that are living and working in Jackson Hole. How did you make those community connections to feel comfortable to do a documentary and go to Tlaxcala?
Oof, I've yet to really feel comfortable directing a documentary about Tlaxcala because I am not Mexican. I am not Latina. Like, it's not my heritage. I am still consider myself like a very intermediate Spanish speaker. And the project that I designed was instead to get to know a community through their eyes by giving them the power and control to make their own films, to direct their own stories, rather than trust me to tell it for them. If I had directed a film about Tlaxcala, it would be very much focused on immigration. And I have learned so much from my students, over 20 different themes of films that they have made. And 2 of them have been about immigration, which to me says so much. Like, my perspective is very limited on how I see people who are not like me. And my students like showed me a whole new world and like so many dimensions of themselves and their culture that I think I would have missed if I had done the work myself.
When you take on this kind of project, how open is the community to accepting you to tell theirs? You're not telling their story. You're allowing them to tell their story. But still, I feel like there's still a bridge you have to cross in order for them to open up to even just tell their story.
Yeah, definitely. I enjoy people. Like, I find that I learn the most from sitting and talking with someone. And I just started small, I guess, here in Jackson. I enrolled in the library's language exchange program, where you're partnered with someone who's like about your same age and has some similar interests, but is not a native English speaker. And so I was partnered with someone who's a native Spanish speaker who wanted to improve her Spanish. And she wanted to improve her English, and I wanted to improve my Spanish. And so for an hour a week over a year, we would meet and talk conversationally, 30 minutes in English and 30 minutes in Spanish. And we got to know each other really well. So well that by the end of that year, she entrusted me to take her daughter to visit family in Tlaxcala that she hadn't seen since she was a little kid, as her daughter's graduation present from high school here. She went on to become a student of mine when I started teaching. So did her son, and is now a member of my board. Like, it all kind of happened slowly, organically. Relationships, I recognize, take time to grow, and I'm willing to put in the time because I'm interested, because I care. And I think ultimately that's how I've gotten to know the Latino community. And it's kind of been like on an individual basis here in Jackson.
Yeah, I think for sure, especially when someone is telling their story, I think it is a growing and learning experience for you and for them. And tell me a couple of your favorite stories that you learned along this journey.
Oh, gosh. Okay. So favorite stories, maybe that weren't made into films, or my favorite films that my students made?
Well, either or. I mean, that's a good point. Ask it that way, but okay. I think favorite experiences that you learned on this journey. Like, what about yourself did you learn? And what about other people did you learn? What was that experience like?
I'm still chewing on it. I'm still chewing on the year that I spent living in Mexico. And I'm so curious still to know this community better. I think I know that I learned that I will always be an outsider, and that's really a tiring role to play when people are always asking you, where are you from? Why are you here? And I see that happening here in Jackson. I see that happening wherever I am in the United States. And someone who is not of the white dominant population, has to like explain their presence, explain their existence. I think that really has given me like pause and empathy to really accept people and be willing to be patient, to let them reveal themselves, and not ask too much. There's a difference between like being curious and being inquisitive and like having it feel like an inquisition where you really have to like explain yourself. I have learned that in Mexico, it's so common across all classes and education backgrounds, etc., to leave Mexico to pursue opportunities. And I think that's taken a toll on Mexico as a country, where like the talent leaves and it doesn't always return. People don't always return. Even though the dream, like this idea of an American dream is not necessarily to stay in the United States. It's to be able to support your family back in Mexico, to provide for your parents or your children who are being raised by your parents. Not everyone desires to stay in the United States, but there's like a deep love of country and culture that is so real and is sacrificed when you emigrate.
Well, I think that's really true, is that, and I've heard many say it, that you come to make the money that you can, so you can send it home to your family. You're basically leaving to provide for your family because there's no work where you are, or you come and you only plan on staying a year, maybe two, boom. Then you have a kid and then the kid's born here. It's just, it's like, okay, how are we going to get back? And then sometimes they don't want to go back. They've made a home here. They've made a life.
Sure.
So it's all very complicated. It's not just one easy answer. That's why the immigration policies are really hard to deal with. And that's why there's been no change. Or, I don't care what president administration you can talk about. It's been going on for years and years and years because it is that complicated. My dad was head of the migrant program for over 33 years, and it was always the same. And this is the hardest thing for people to understand, is this kind of transition across our southern border. Well, we drew the political lines. So this was all Mexico, not necessarily Wyoming, but all the way coming into Wyoming was Spanish territory up until, but California was part of Mexico until they drew political lines. Families that lived in California they were Mexican.
Yeah.
They were Spanish. They were part of the colonization, the Spaniard colonization. It's so much deeper than just a borderline.
Yeah.
And I think people simplistically think about it that way, and it's not. So I always hear people say Trump's policies, and I'm like, you have no idea how long it's been going on.
That's very true. That is very true. And I think I have Trump to credit for like putting it on my radar. Whereas before I was really unaware of Mexican policies, of presence of Mexicans in the US, pre the US, the Americas, California, Alta California is what we now know as California in the United States. And all the way up into the southwest corner of Wyoming was Mexico.
Right. Yep. So it's just really interesting. And at that time, it wasn't named Mexico. It was actually the Spanish territory.
Correct. Yeah.
This is the kind of history that has been lost in our schools, I feel, being a Latina.
Yeah.
I feel this has been the history that's been lost, that people don't really understand what was happening. They get the whole Thanksgiving and the Plymouth Rock story and all that. They never hear the other story. It's very interesting to me. That's not the one that is really pronounced in our history books when you're growing up and learning about history. And I guess it is because I come from a Hispanic family, and and my dad is an educator and was an educator in the school system, we were always making those corrections in our family. So I hear, that for people that don't know and live in the West, I think it's so important to know, especially in our cowboy culture, how much influence the Mexican and the Spaniard has had on our cowboy culture. Immense. And even on the Indian culture. So it's just such a mixture of influences that have taken place in the West. And it's beautiful. I mean, I love it, but it's all very complicated as well. So, Alyson, so now that you've had this experience, how are you going to grow from this, and what is going to be your next project?
I'm so embarrassed. Somehow I muted myself and I was like feeding off of what you were saying there. Because before we go on to what's next, I'd love to just riff a little bit on how important Tlaxcala is to Mexican history. Tlaxcala is a state that's like joked about kind of the same way Wyoming is. Like, oh, Wyoming's a state? And in Mexico, they say, Tlaxcala sí existe? Like, it exists? And so it's funny to me that we have this similar reputation amongst our respective countrymen. And Tlaxcala is like vital to what has become Mexico, because it's the Tlaxcalan indigenous people were allies of the Spanish. And without becoming allies of the Spanish, who knows like what would have transpired of the Mexican Empire, of Spain's empire in Mexico. And by allying with the Spanish to defeat their enemy, the Aztecs, or the Mexica, Tlaxcalans were able to remain somewhat sovereign and have rights that other indigenous cultures throughout that time and region did not have. And so Tlaxcalans became colonizers. They say that Tlaxcala is like the cradle of the nation because they mixed with the Spanish to have this mestizo race, this mixed race of indigenous and Spanish patrimony, and then started to move north to colonize other areas of the Americas, all the way up into, where we were just talking about, California and Arizona and all the way into Wyoming. So they say there were like 400 families from Tlaxcala, from central Mexico, that became like the major colonizers as they moved out into the rest of the Americas. And there are a lot of the names that we hear so commonly, like Lopez, Hernandez, but like a lot of the EZ names, Gomez. And these, of course, were Spanish last names, but then were like carried over as families formed and took on the Spanish last name. I think Tlaxcala is like the most fascinating part of Mexico to me. And I wish that we were teaching more in school about the history of the Americas, and especially for kids growing up in the diaspora of like living in Teton County, but your entire family is from Tlaxcala, Mexico. I wish they knew the history and could feel the pride in where they come from. My parents talked to me a lot about where our ancestors were from. And so I have an attachment, and a lot of that is through food, like recipes that were carried down over generations. But knowing like the history and feeling a connection to your culture is really important and is often lost when you've immigrated.
Yes, so true. So what is the name Spery?
It was a German name that was shortened. On my dad's side, there's English, Scottish, and then German heritage. And they were longer in the United States than on my mom's side, which were like the second wave of immigration through Ellis Island. And they came from Italy and Austria. My family immigrated as well to this country, as so many have. I mean, there was a time when my Italian ancestors were considered not white. I say that because, like, you look at me, I'm a white person, identify as white. But that wasn't always the case. The Italians were discriminated against in a way that I see really similarly happen over and over again with Latino heritage.
Oh, yeah. The Italians are very dark. It's amazing that they consider anyone in Western Europe to be white, but you're absolutely right. And even at that, I mean, when you go to big cities and there's always these very distinct neighborhoods, whether they're Italian or Irish or Chinese or, people find their community.
I mean, once you say it that way, I think people get it. And the Sister Cities project is like shining light on that there are these pockets there are these communities that have developed because of the human, just like human behavior to go where you know someone or go where you have a job opportunity. I have never moved anywhere in my short lifetime where I haven't had a friend or a family member or a job like pulling me there. I've never put my finger on the map and said, I think I'll try out Madagascar or wherever my finger may land. And so like you have communities from, I don't know, Jalisco in Chicago, for example. You have sister cities all over this globe where people are inclined to go where they have a connection, whether it's a family member or, this well-worn path of immigration over 30 years or more.
Oh my gosh. So true. And we are so spoiled because we have a phone.
Oh yeah.
They just went.
Right.
To these faraway places. They didn't know what they were going to find there, but they, were pursuing a dream, desire. They needed to leave. There's so many different situations, but when people immigrated, it wasn't the same as it is now.
Oh my God, no, they're so courageous.
There's no direct flight.
They were so courageous. I can't even imagine.
I know. It's amazing, isn't it? Well, you still haven't told me, like, what is next for you? What are you thinking about?
I am thinking about how important it seems for me to step into the role of director. I've been teaching, I don't know, for like 5 years, basically since I learned how to operate a camera. I've been teaching other people. And it is important to me that there are voices and perspectives that are often overlooked in mainstream media, that the kind of work I want to do is like putting front and center those voices and making sure that they have the autonomy to speak for themselves. And I want to figure out how to balance that with like this desire that I'm feeling to say something myself. So I've been thinking about how to maybe engage some of my students from here and in Tlaxcala in collaborating on some projects together to tell maybe some longer format stories that have more of a narrative structure and some character development that just go a little deeper into the nuances beyond what my students communicated in their short films. And I'd love to be able to work with my former students to give them opportunities to be in production and where we could collaborate together.
Oh my gosh, that'd be so amazing. I want to hear more about that. I'm super excited. And I mean, you've done a great job jumping, between these two cultures, between Jackson Hole and Tlaxcala. And I know that you can go so much deeper than, like you were saying, let's go to the next level. Let's go to the next place where we can, tell a bigger story, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So that'll be so wonderful, Alyson. I wish you so much luck. And I just thank you for joining me today.
Oh, thanks, Emmy. I'm just flattered that you were interested. Yeah, I appreciate all the support from Wyoming Humanities too.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us for this episode of What's Your Why? Brought to you by Wyoming Humanities with support from Wyoming Community Foundation and generous supporters like you. To learn more, go to thinkwhy.org, subscribe, and never miss a show.